Welcome to The Explainer. Sometimes the most convincing evidence in the world just isn't enough to change someone's mind. Today, we're going to unpack a powerful story about exactly that, about doubt, stubborn hearts, and a really surprising path back to belief. And it all kicks off with a man who decided to ignore a volcano.
Yeah, you heard that right. Let's talk about a guy named Harry Randall Truman. Back in 1980, he was living on the slopes of Mount St. Helens, and all the scientists were screaming that this thing was about to blow its top.
So here's the deal with Truman. He'd lived on that mountain for decades. It was his home. So when geologists showed up with charts and data, and police were practically begging him to leave, he just wouldn't do it. His emotional connection, his deep attachment to that mountain, completely overrode all the facts. And tragically, when the volcano finally erupted, he was killed. And that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why do people sometimes reject clear, life-saving evidence that's staring them right in the face? Was Truman's problem really a lack of information? I mean, he had all the facts. Or was there something deeper going on?
Well, the source we're looking at today argues that, a lot like Truman, the disciples after the crucifixion weren't having a head problem, they had a heart problem. Their minds weren't closed because they were ignorant, they were closed because of a stubbornness that was born from absolute despair and shattered hopes.
Okay, so let's dive into the first piece of the story from our source material. We're going to look at the very first witnesses to the resurrection and the flat-out rejection they got from their closest friends. You really have to picture the scene here. Jesus' followers are just completely broken. They're all huddled together, the text says, grieving and weeping. Everything they'd hoped for, this incredible future, it all seemed to die on that cross. And now they're just adrift in a sea of grief. And into this room, just thick with despair, walks the very first witness, Mary Magdalene. Now, the source makes a point of telling us about her past, that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her. In that culture, let's be honest, that didn't make her the most reliable witness in the room. She was an unlikely person to carry this world-changing news, and yet she was the one who was chosen. So she comes bursting in with just the most incredible news you could ever imagine. He's alive. I've actually seen him. And what's their response? Complete rejection. They hear the words, but they refuse to believe her. And this just perfectly nails the core issue, right? The evidence is right there, but it's just bounced off them. And this is where it gets really interesting when you look at the original Greek. The word used for would not believe is apisteo. Now, this isn't a passive, I'm not so sure. No, this is an active refusal. It's a conscious choice to reject what they've just heard. You see, their grief had become a kind of shield, hardening their hearts against any new information. All right, let's look at another example here, which really dives into how our own ideas about how things should be can totally blind us to the reality that is, quite literally, walking right next to us. So we meet these 2 disciples on a road, and notice the direction they're going. They are walking away from Jerusalem, the center of everything, the city of promise, and they're heading towards a little village called Emmaus. This isn't just a walk in the country. The source points out that this is a spiritual retreat. They're walking away from hope and right back into their old lives of disappointment. As they're walking, a stranger comes up and asks them what's got them so down, and their answer says it all. They say, "We had hoped he was the one." That past tense, it's everything. You see, Jesus didn't match their picture of a king who would kick out the Romans. Their expectation was so specific that when it didn't happen exactly that way, they just wrote the whole thing off as a failure. I mean, the irony here is just absolutely staggering. Just think about the information they already had. They knew the women had come back with their story, they knew the tomb was empty, and to top it all off, the guy they were mourning was literally walking beside them, having a conversation with them. But they just couldn't see it because every single fact was being filtered through this lens of their own failure. So how in the world do you break through that kind of deep, emotionally charged disbelief? Well, when faced with their total blindness, Jesus' method for opening their eyes is, well, it's surprisingly simple and incredibly profound. You'd think, right? You'd expect some kind of dazzling reveal, a flash of light, some huge miracle, something to just shock their senses and force them to see who he was. But nope, that is not what happens at all. Instead of a big, flashy miracle, he gives them a lesson. He doesn't perform for them, he explains to them. He becomes an interpreter, deciding that the way to fix their hearts is by reframing their understanding through the scriptures. He gives them a Bible study on the road. And the Greek verb the source points out here is just fantastic. It's diarmenouin. It means to explain something thoroughly, to break it down point by point. It's actually the root of our word hermeneutics, the whole study of interpretation. So Jesus didn't just give them the cliff notes. He painstakingly walked them through all the scriptures, reinterpreting everything they thought they knew about the Messiah. So you can really see the process here, can't you? It starts with a pretty sharp rebuke. He calls them slow of heart. Then comes the interpretation, connecting all the dots from the scriptures that they already knew. And that leads to the big realization. Later, they look at each other and say, "Did not our hearts burn within us?" The right explanation didn't just give them new information, it lit a fire in their hearts. Okay, this brings us to the final scene, where Jesus finally confronts the other 11 disciples. And this encounter, according to our source, reveals maybe the most profound paradox in this whole story. A really harsh rebuke, followed by a world-changing mission. So Jesus just appears in the room while they're eating. And he doesn't start with a hug. He starts with a confrontation. He straight up rebukes them for their unbelief and their stubbornness. He diagnoses their problem right to their faces. And he hits them with this incredibly intense Greek term for what's wrong with them, scleroscardia. It literally means hardness of heart, like a heart that has become calloused, like stone. He's not pulling any punches here. He's naming the spiritual disease that kept them from believing the eyewitnesses. But listen, this is the crucial point. The rebuke, it wasn't a rejection. Calling out their failure wasn't a final condemnation. According to the source, it was absolutely necessary preparation. You have to know what the problem is before you can be part of the solution. Exposing their weakness was the very first step before he could send them out on their mission. So when you boil it all down, the argument we've been unpacking is this. The real barrier to belief isn't usually a lack of proof. It's a heart that's been closed off, hardened by grief or fear or just broken dreams. And the key that unlocks that heart isn't always a bigger miracle. It's a deeper understanding of what's happening through the clarifying lens of the Word. Which leaves us with one last, pretty stunning question. We've just spent all this time looking at a group of fearful, stubborn, unbelieving people. So how on earth did these people become the witnesses who launched a movement that would literally turn the world upside down? The source suggests the answer isn't found in their personal strength, but in the incredible grace of the one who called them out, but then refused to give up on them.